In the frozen north of early medieval Europe, fragmented Scandinavian societies slowly developed a mastery of the sea that would eventually carry them far beyond their isolated world. From the late 8th century onward, these seafarers, known as the Vikings, began to reshape Europe through raids, trade, settlement, and conquest, leaving a legacy that would outlast their age. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, because this isn't just another history story. This is the rise, expansion, and fall of one of the most powerful forces the medieval world ever saw. And you're about to see how it all really unfolded. In the far north of Europe, beyond the borders of the Roman world, beyond the reach of classical civilization, there existed a land that few outsiders ever truly understood. A land of ice, forests, mountains, and endless coastline. Scandinavia. To outsiders, it looked like the edge of the world. But to those who lived there, it was the center of survival. This is where the Viking story begins, not with conquest, not with war, but with isolation. Because long before the world feared the Vikings feared the world. Early medieval Scandinavia was not a unified kingdom. It was a fragmented landscape of small tribes, chieftains, and rival families. Power was not inherited through nations. It was earned through loyalty, strength, and reputation. There were no capitals, no empires, no central authority. Only local leaders competing for land, followers, and survival. A chieftain ruled as long as he could maintain loyalty, and loyalty was fragile. It depended on generosity, success in battle, and the ability to provide protection and wealth. If a leader failed, his followers left. If he died, his power vanished. This created a society in constant motion, a political system without stability. But in that instability, something powerful was forming. Scandinavia itself shaped its people more than any ruler ever could. Unlike much of Europe, where roads and farmland connected communities, Scandinavia was divided by geography. Dense forests made inland travel difficult. Mountains isolated settlements. Winter froze movement for months at a time. But the sea was different. It connected everything. Fjords cut deep into Norway. Thousands of lakes dotted Sweden. Coastlines stretched endlessly across Denmark. For many communities, water travel was easier than land travel. And so, over generations, Scandinavians became expert seafarers, not by choice, but by necessity. They learned to read winds, currents, storms, and tides. They learned to survive on open water. And slowly, the sea stopped being a boundary. It became a pathway. By the 7th century, Scandinavian shipbuilding had reached a turning point. The development of clinker-built vessels created ships that were light, flexible, fast, capable of ocean travel, and capable of river navigation. This was revolutionary, because for the first time, a single vessel could cross open seas, sail up rivers, and land directly on shore without ports. These ships did not just transport people, they erased geography. And at the center of this innovation was the longship. Sleek, fast, deadly. Designed not for comfort, but for dominance. Before Viking expansion began, Europe was undergoing its own transformation. The Carolingian Empire was forming in the west. The Byzantine Empire controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Islamic caliphates dominated trade routes stretching into Asia. This was a world of growing connections. But Scandinavia remained largely outside it. Not because it was weak, but because it was distant. However, distance is not isolation when you have ships. And by the late 8th century, Scandinavians were no longer isolated. They were ready to enter the wider world. violently. In the year 793, everything changed. A small monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of England, was attacked. Monks were killed, treasures were stolen, religious sanctity was destroyed. To Europe, it was horrifying. To the attackers, it was opportunity. This was not random violence. It was calculated. Monasteries were wealthy, isolated, poorly defended, and filled with portable wealth. Gold, silver, religious artifacts. What followed Lindisfarne was not a single raid. It was the beginning of an era. After Lindisfarne, Viking activity increased rapidly across Europe. Coastal monasteries became frequent targets, then villages, then towns. But early raids were seasonal. Vikings would sail in summer and return home in winter. At first, this made them appear as opportunistic attackers. But something deeper was happening. They were learning. They were mapping Europe, identifying weak points, observing political instability, and understanding where wealth was concentrated. This was intelligence gathering disguised as raiding, and it would soon evolve into something far more dangerous. By the early 9th century, Viking activity had changed. They were no longer just raiders. They were becoming occupiers. They began staying longer in foreign lands, building camps, then fortifications, then settlements. River systems became highways of invasion. The Seine led to Paris. The Thames led deep into England. The Rhine opened Central Europe. In 845, a Viking fleet sailed into Paris. The city was not conquered, it was ransomed. This created a new economic model. Why destroy when you can profit? But Europe was beginning to adapt, and the Vikings would soon be forced to change again. In 865, something unprecedented arrived in England. A massive Viking force known as the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raids, this was not seasonal. It was permanent. Its goal was conquest. Kingdoms fell one by one. Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, only Wessex resisted. Led by Alfred the Great, Wessex became the final Anglo-Saxon stronghold. After years of war, a turning point came in 878 at the Battle of Edington. A settlement followed. The Danelaw was established, large regions of eastern England under Viking control. But the Vikings did not rule as foreign occupiers. They settled, they farmed, they married, they integrated. And slowly, two cultures merged. Old Norse shaped English language, law, and identity. The Viking Age was no longer outside Europe, it was inside it. While England was transforming, Vikings expanded into Ireland and Scotland. In 841, they founded Dublin, not as a temporary camp, but as a permanent city. Other settlements followed across Ireland's coast. Meanwhile, Scotland's northern islands, Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, became deeply Norse. A hybrid culture emerged. Norse Gaels, a people who combined Scandinavian and Celtic traditions. Control of maritime trade routes made them powerful regional players. The Viking world was no longer one movement. It was becoming multiple civilizations. While Western Vikings expanded into Europe, Eastern Vikings followed a different path. They moved through river systems into Eastern Europe, trading furs, honey, wax, and slaves for silver and luxury goods. They connected Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world. In 862, Rurik established rule in Novgorod. In 882, Oleg took Kiev. This formed the Kievan Rus, a hybrid state of Norse rulers and Slavic populations. At the far end of these trade routes lay Constantinople, the richest city in the world. So impressive that Viking warriors became its elite guards. The Varangian Guard, feared trusted, and loyal to the emperor. As Scandinavia centralized, many families left entirely. They sailed west into the Atlantic. Iceland was settled in the late 9th century. There they created the Althing, one of the world's earliest parliamentary systems. Then came Greenland, a harsh, isolated colony founded by Eric the Red. And from Greenland, exploration continued. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson reached North America. Vinland. Modern archaeology confirms Norse presence at Lanso Meadows. But settlement failed. Distance, conflict, isolation. The limits of survival had been reached. By the start of the 11th century, the Viking world was larger than ever before. From North America to Baghdad, from England to Constantinople, from Arctic seas to river empires. But something was shifting beneath the surface. Kings were rising in Scandinavia. Christianity was spreading, old beliefs were fading, and Europe itself was becoming stronger, more organized, more resistant. The world the Vikings had exploited for centuries was beginning to close. And for the first time in 300 years, the direction of history was about to reverse. By the time the first Viking longships returned from their raids along the coasts of England, something fundamental had changed in Northern Europe. What had begun as scattered seasonal raids, brief, violent, opportunistic, was evolving into something far more ambitious. Because the Vikings were no longer simply striking the edges of Europe, they were learning its shape. And once you understand the shape of a world, you can begin to control it. In the early Viking Age, raiding was instinctive. Strike fast, take what you can, disappear before resistance forms. But as the decades passed, something subtle emerged across the North Sea world. The Vikings stopped thinking like raiders and started thinking like rulers. They were no longer satisfied with returning home with silver and relics. They began asking a more dangerous question. What if we never left? This question would reshape England, Ireland, France, and eventually Eastern Europe itself. Because settlement changes everything. Raiding is temporary, but settlement is permanent, and permanence requires structure. In the year 865, a force arrived on the shores of East Anglia that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would describe as something entirely new. A great army, not a raid, not a band of opportunists, but a coordinated, sustained invasion force, later known as the Great Heathen Army. Led by figures remembered in legend as the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, this army did not behave like earlier Viking groups. They did not return home after a season. They stayed. They conquered systematically. Northumbria fell first, then East Anglia, then large portions of Mercia. One kingdom after another collapsed under sustained pressure. Only Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, managed to resist. But even resistance came at a cost, because Alfred did something unprecedented. He adapted. He built fortified towns known as burhs. He reorganized his army. He created a standing naval force to challenge Viking ships directly. And slowly, the tide began to shift. Not through superiority, but through adaptation. By the late 9th century, war had given way to settlement. The result was a political and cultural division of England, a southern Anglo-Saxon kingdom under Wessex, and a northern and eastern Viking-controlled region known as the Danelaw. But calling it controlled is misleading, because the Danelaw was not a colony. It was a hybrid society. Viking settlers became farmers, warriors became landowners. Norse law merged with Anglo-Saxon tradition, and something entirely new began to form. A cultural fusion. Old Norse words entered English permanently. Sky, egg, window, knife. Even everyday verbs like take, give, and call carried Viking linguistic DNA. This was no longer invasion. This was transformation, and it was irreversible. While England was being divided and reshaped, another transformation was unfolding across the Irish Sea. In the year 841, Vikings established a fortified base at Dublin. But like everywhere else they went, they did not remain outsiders for long. Dublin became a permanent city, one of the first true urban centers in Ireland. From there, Viking influence spread. Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, Cork. These were not temporary raiding camps. They were thriving trade hubs. And crucially, they became politically integrated into Irish life. Irish kings formed alliances with Norse warlords. Marriages connected families across cultural lines. New identities emerged. The Norse Gaels, a people who were neither fully Scandinavian nor fully Irish, but something entirely new. And in these coastal cities, power was no longer defined by land alone, but by control of the sea. While Western Vikings are often remembered for raids on monasteries and kingdoms, the Eastern Vikings followed a very different path. They moved through rivers instead of oceans. The Volga, the Dnieper, the vast waterways of Eastern Europe became their highways. And instead of burning cities, they built trade networks. Furs from the north, silver from the Islamic world, silks from Byzantium, spices from Asia. This was not chaos, it was commerce. These Vikings became known as the Varangians, and they did something extraordinary. They didn't just raid Eastern Europe, they helped build it. In 862, according to medieval chronicles, a Viking leader named Rurik was invited to rule in Novgorod. Whether myth or reality, what followed is historically undeniable. A Norse-led political structure began to emerge in Eastern Europe. By 882, another leader, Oleg, had taken control of Kiev. This marked the beginning of the Kievan Rus, a powerful federation of Slavic and Norse influence. Here, Vikings did not remain Vikings for long. They assimilated. They married local populations. They adopted Slavic language. But they also left their mark on governance, trade, and military organization. And from this fusion would eventually emerge one of the most important civilizations in Eastern European history. If Western Europe feared Viking raids, the Byzantine Empire did something very different. It hired them. By the 10th century, Scandinavian warriors were serving as elite guards for the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. They became known as the Varangian Guard. Chosen for their loyalty, strength, and perceived lack of local political ambition, they served as imperial bodyguards. Tall, blonde, armored in foreign steel, wielding axes in palace corridors of the most sophisticated empire in Europe. It was a striking contrast. Warriors from frozen northern forests, protecting emperors in the marble halls of the Mediterranean world. This was globalization before globalization. While Viking power expanded outward, another experiment was taking shape in the North Atlantic. Iceland. Settled in the late 9th century, Iceland was unlike anything in Europe at the time. No king, no centralized authority. Instead, governance was built around assemblies called the Althing, one of the earliest parliamentary systems in human history. Here, law was not imposed, it was agreed upon. Disputes were settled through public debate. Power was distributed among chieftains, and society functioned through negotiation rather than domination. It was fragile, but it worked, and it would last for centuries. Further west still, Viking expansion reached even more extreme frontiers. In the 980s, Eric the Red established settlements in Greenland. Despite the name, Greenland was harsh, icy, and unforgiving. But it was livable, for a time. Farming communities formed along the fjords. Trade routes connected Greenland back to Iceland and Norway. And from Greenland, they went even further. Around the year 1000, Viking explorers led by Leif Erikson reached a land they called Vinland. Modern archaeology confirms Norse presence at Lons o Meadows in Newfoundland. They built shelters, explored the land, encountered indigenous peoples they called Skraelings. But the settlement did not last. Distance, conflict, logistical isolation. It was simply too far from everything else they knew. And so, they left. But the achievement remained staggering. Europe had reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. While Vikings expanded outward, their homelands were changing inward. Kings began consolidating power. Christianity spread across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Old Norse religion faded. Odin, Thor, Freya, replaced gradually by Christian doctrine. Harald Bluetooth unified Denmark. Norway followed under Harald Fairhair. Sweden centralized more slowly. The Viking world was dissolving, but not collapsing. It was transforming into medieval Europe. The symbolic end of the Viking Age is often marked by one year, 1066. King Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded England, claiming the throne. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Weeks later, William of Normandy invaded England and won the Battle of Hastings. Ironically, William was descended from Vikings himself. Normandy had been settled by Norsemen generations earlier. They had become French in language and culture, but their lineage remained. The Viking Age did not end in defeat. It ended in absorption. By the end of the 11th century, the Vikings as a distinct people had disappeared from the historical stage. But their legacy had not. It had spread into empires, languages, governments, trade networks, and even into the DNA of medieval Europe itself. But this raises a deeper question. If the Vikings did not disappear, if they were absorbed rather than defeated, then where exactly did they go? And more importantly, what parts of the modern world are still Viking without even realizing it? By the end of the 11th century, something unusual had happened to the Vikings. They had not been destroyed. They had not been decisively conquered in a single final war. Instead, they had been slowly absorbed into the very world they once terrified. Their ships still sailed. Their descendants still ruled. Their languages still echoed in place names, trade routes, and everyday speech. But the Vikings themselves, as a distinct force of raiders, explorers, and pagan seafarers, were fading. Not suddenly, but completely. And what replaced them would shape Europe for the next 1,000 years. History likes clean endings, a battle, a fall, a decisive collapse. But the Viking Age refuses to fit that pattern. Because what ended in the 11th century was not the people, it was the identity. The Viking world had always been defined by movement, raiding seasons, expansion cycles, constant outward pressure. But by the thousands, Europe itself had changed. Kings were stronger, borders were more organized. Christianity had unified much of the continent under shared religious structure. And most importantly, resistance had adapted. Fortifications improved. Naval defense strengthened. Armies became professional. The Viking advantage, surprise, and mobility was slowly neutralized, not by a single enemy, but by the evolution of Europe itself. One of the most profound transformations of the Viking world was not political, it was spiritual. For centuries, Norse religion had shaped how Vikings understood existence. A universe governed by Odin, wisdom, war, sacrifice. Thor, strength, protection. Loki, chaos and transformation. But by the 10th and 11th centuries, Christianity was spreading rapidly through Scandinavia. It entered through trade, through kings, through political alliances with Europe. And slowly, it replaced the old belief systems. Harald Bluetooth in Denmark famously claimed to have made the Danes Christian. Norway followed after intense resistance. Sweden lagged behind, with pagan practices surviving longest in rural areas. But the shift was irreversible. Temples became churches, rituals were replaced by sacraments. And the mythological worldview of the Vikings, rich, complex, and deeply tied to nature, was gradually erased from official life. What remained survived only in fragments: poems, sagas, oral tradition, and memory. In early Viking society, power was personal. A leader ruled because people followed him. Loyalty was earned through success in battle, generosity, and reputation. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, something fundamental had changed. Power became institutional. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden evolved into centralized monarchies. Laws were written instead of spoken. Taxation replaced tribute. Armies became permanent rather than seasonal. Kings ruled not just warriors, but entire populations. This marked the end of the Viking political world. Not because it failed, but because it evolved into something larger. Medieval Europe. Perhaps nowhere is Viking transformation more visible than in Normandy. In the early 10th century, Viking leader Rollo was granted land in northern France by the Frankish king. In exchange, he pledged loyalty and accepted Christianity. Over generations, his people adopted the French language, integrated into Frankish nobility, lost their Norse identity. But they did not lose their ambition. Because in 1066, a descendant of those Vikings, William of Normandy, launched an invasion of England. And at the Battle of Hastings, he conquered it. This moment is deeply ironic, the last great conquest associated with the Viking world was led by people who were no longer Vikings. They were French-speaking Christian nobles of Norse descent. The Viking Age had not ended. It had been transformed into European power politics. Even after the traditional Viking Age ended, Scandinavian influence did not disappear overnight. It continued in slower, quieter forms. Trade networks expanded into the Baltic. Merchant leagues like the early Hanseatic system began to dominate northern European commerce. Norwegian influence persisted in the North Atlantic. Iceland remained semi-independent for centuries. Greenland settlements survived for hundreds of years before eventually fading due to climate change and isolation. And in Eastern Europe, the Kievan Rus developed into a major medieval power, blending Norse leadership traditions with Slavic culture. Even after the Viking identity disappeared, their structures remained. One of the most haunting chapters of Viking history is the disappearance of Greenland's Norse colonies. For centuries, small communities survived on the edge of the Arctic world. They farmed, they traded, they struggled against an increasingly harsh climate. But over time, sea routes became unstable. Trade weakened, climate conditions deteriorated during the Little Ice Age, and contact with Europe faded. By the 15th century, the Norse Greenland settlements had vanished. No dramatic collapse, no final battle. Just silence. A civilization that had once crossed oceans simply disappeared into isolation. While Scandinavian identity faded in Europe, one Viking tradition endured far longer in a surprising place: Constantinople. The Varangian Guard, composed originally of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors, served as elite protectors of the Byzantine emperor. They were trusted because they had no local political ties. They were outsiders, loyal only to the emperor who paid them. For centuries, these warriors fought in palace corridors, foreign wars, and imperial ceremonies, even as Europe changed around them. The last echoes of Viking martial culture survived in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The disappearance of the Vikings is often misunderstood. They were not wiped out. They were not defeated in a single defining collapse. Instead, three forces dissolved their identity. 1. Political integration. Scandinavian kingdoms became European monarchies. 2. Religious transformation. Paganism gave way to Christianity. 3. Cultural absorption. Viking settlers merged into local populations everywhere they went. England, Ireland, France, Russia, Iceland, Greenland. In each place, they became something new, not outsiders, but locals. Even after their identity faded, the Vikings left something permanent behind: language. Many everyday English words come directly from Old Norse: sky, window, egg, knife. They also shaped grammar, place names, and regional dialects across Britain and beyond. But their deeper legacy is not linguistic, it is conceptual. Because the Vikings introduced Europe to something revolutionary: the idea that distance is not a boundary, that the ocean is not an end, but a path. When European explorers like Columbus, Cabot, and da Gama set out centuries later, they were not starting from zero. They were inheriting a worldview that had been shaped centuries earlier. A worldview in which the unknown was navigable. The world was connected. Opportunity lay beyond the horizon. Vikings had already proven this in Iceland, Greenland, North America, the rivers of Russia, the coasts of Britain and Ireland. They did not just explore the world, they expanded the mental map of it. The Viking legacy can be traced through nearly every major development in European history. Trade networks to Hanseatic League, maritime skill to age of exploration, legal assemblies to parliamentary systems, river trade routes to Eastern European states, colonial expansion mindset to global empires. Even modern political geography in Northern Europe still reflects Viking settlement patterns. Cities like Dublin, York, Kiev, Riga, Bergen all carry echoes of that expansion. The Viking Age ends where all historical eras end, not with disappearance, but with transformation. Because the Vikings did something rare in history. They did not remain static long enough to be destroyed. They adapted, they migrated, they merged, and in doing so, they became invisible. But invisibility is not absence. It is integration. By the end of this transformation, there were no more Vikings in the traditional sense. No unified culture, no pagan kingdoms, no raiding fleets crossing the North Sea under dragon sails. But the question remains, if the Vikings are gone, why does their influence still feel so present in the modern world? And more importantly, did the Viking Age truly end? Or did it simply evolve into something we now call history itself? If you made it to the end, you now know the Vikings were far more than raiders. They were explorers, settlers, and world shapers whose legacy still echoes through modern history. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a like, subscribe for more cinematic history deep dives, and tell me in the comments which civilization you want to explore next.